They walked me right into a trap by failing to exercise a reasonable standard of care and then blamed me, the youngest person in the equation, for not knowing better, and then levied the full weight of consequence against me. But they apply a completely different standard to themselves.
Welcome to Perverted Justice. This is not just a story. It's a call to action for integrity and radical honesty, in spite of personal cost. Now here's your host, Shielagh Clark.
Welcome back. This is episode 20. After last week's episode launched, I realized that I really should have been more direct in my summary, and I posted a clarifying statement on Facebook that I'm going to read now so that it's recorded here. To the church and attorneys, litigation was just a tug-of-war over money. Who could make the most compelling argument, regardless of accuracy, that I was or was not damaged, and to what degree the church had or had not been negligent. This is why evidence was destroyed by the church, a truth teller was fired, and 1 million motions were filed by the church to bar evidence from trial. We haven't gotten to that yet, but we will soon. To me, litigation was about the truth. It was a way to force parties to engage with an issue they were otherwise refusing to engage with, forcing people to speak on the record, whether they wanted to or not, forcing the hidden things out into the light so they could be untangled and, hopefully, set right. My claims were dependent on me staying broken because it would produce a larger payout, which I didn't care about. The church had a vested interest in me staying wicked because it shielded them from the cost of the truth, which they didn't care about. None of this was about reality, but about money and image, which also impacts income. To say this was frustrating would be the understatement of the century. And in that vein, today we're moving on to insurance. I'm certainly no expert, but I'll do my best to explain. The church insurance policies from the early 2000s were written by Church Mutual, and they covered 2 years at a time. So my abuse spanned 3 separate policies. The early abuse caught the tail end of the first policy, lived through a second, and then into the start of a third policy. Liability insurance does not cover intentional criminal acts, and a standard church insurance policy doesn't cover professional services like counseling. So both of these things have to be added as separate endorsements. The church policies included a $300,000 endorsement for sexual abuse and a $1 million endorsement for negligent counseling. From the get-go, the church offered $300,000 and said that it was the full limit of the insurance. And I will come back to this point in a minute. My attorneys argued that since the abuse spanned 3 policies, the $300,000 endorsement should apply to each policy period independently, bringing the minimum insurance payout to $900,000. We'll also return to this in a minute. They were looking for ways to tap into the $1 million endorsement for bad counseling. Okay. I knew that the negligent counseling angle was rotten from the start, since the counseling endorsement clearly states that the claim cannot arise out of a sexual abuse claim, and the statute of limitations had not been suspended for counseling anyway, only for sexual abuse. And for whatever it's worth, I would like to note that had negligent counseling been on the table, it is my belief that just Lori Nargi's behavior in the aftermath of the abuse would have produced a $1 million judgment. We'll talk more about that in season 2. So for years at this point, in 2023, the church attorney had been offering $300,000, and my attorneys were arguing that it wasn't enough. And I want to clarify here that I am not going to speak about my settlement. I am not legally allowed to speak about my settlement, but the negotiations have been put on the internet by the church's attorney, which makes them fair game for me. Okay, so I believe it was the summer of 2023 when my attorneys told me they believed the church attorney was acting in bad faith and they wanted to pursue a bad faith judgment against them. They had decided to have the church insurance policy professionally reviewed, and if it was determined that the abuse endorsement did apply to each policy period separately, they wanted to move forward with this bad faith filing. So basically, what it would mean is that if the church attorney was found to be operating in the best interest of the insurance company and offering bad advice to their client by refusing to negotiate a more reasonable settlement, and that bad advice resulted in the church going to trial, the insurance company would be responsible for the entire judgment, no matter how many millions of dollars it was, and regardless of the true limit on the policy. I had two main issues with this plan. First, shifting all liability to the insurance company was only going to reinforce bad behavior in the church leadership. And second, this filing involved making a new, much lower demand that was potentially within the limits of the policy, and if it was accepted, it would end the case. If we offered them, so part of the deal would be to offer $900,000 along with the threat of this bad faith filing. And if the church accepted, then the case would be over. If they rejected it, the bad faith filing would follow. Okay? This kind of creating a paper trail for the court to use later. And I didn't want to do this. I did not want to make an offer that then I was going to be forced to accept because I didn't want to settle. I wanted to go to trial. So I was super stressed out about this whole thing, and I actually ended up in the hospital having a panic attack for the second time since filing this lawsuit. It took forever to get the policy review back, and once we did get it, it actually proved that the church attorney had been telling the truth the entire time about policy limits. The sexual abuse endorsement applied one time and only one time. They had indeed been offering the full amount of the insurance policy from the beginning, which I have to point out, my attorney said he has never seen this before. He has never seen an insurance company lead with their best offer on the table, which is why they didn't believe it. I was relieved to hear this because it took the bad faith effort off the table and meant we were still headed to trial. I wasn't going to be forced into offering and accepting a settlement that I didn't want. But I did get some pressure to settle at this point from my attorneys, because they now knew that their maximum payout was 33% of $300,000. And from a business vantage point, they wanted to minimize risk and cost and take the offer while it was still a guaranteed payout. Going to trial always involves the risk of walking away with nothing, and even if we secured a $5 million judgment at trial, the insurance company would still cut a check for $300,000, and it would be up to me to attempt to collect the rest if I chose to do that. Churches are in a protected class and cannot be forced to liquidate their assets to settle a civil judgment, so the worst thing that could have happened is they would file bankruptcy to reduce the judgment, and a court would eventually prescribe some monthly amount for them to pay me over an extended period of time. But I could not take their property. However, in the spirit of radical honesty, I have to admit here that during this stretch of time, I began to hope for a massive judgment at trial, one equal to 4 or 5 times the value of the property, that I could potentially wield as leverage to obtain the property in exchange for canceling the debt. Not so that I could sell it. This wasn't a backdoor to money, but so that I could turn it into a rape crisis center or crisis housing or a combination of both, in order to force the property to work to heal in others the trauma that it represented in my own life. This, of course, was always an impossibility, but I have to be honest about the direction that I began to lean in my contempt for the incomprehensible wickedness I had encountered in my pursuit of redemption. I'll be honest, sometimes I still wish that this was possible. When I was in high school, I had a friend who I took a lot of technology courses with. He was a die-hard atheist, and he and I would debate the existence of God endlessly. I think we both enjoyed the debate for the sake of debate itself, and I loved that we could both engage from completely different positions and still be good friends. At the end of senior year, I sent him a birthday card in the mail. We were taking basic electronics in the most remote classroom in the building at the end of the technology wing. He said nothing about the card during class, but as I was leaving, I heard his voice behind me in the very empty hallway, reading back to me what I wrote in the birthday card. I pray that you may have power to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love which surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. Ephesians 3:18 and 19. That moment is seared into my brain. Actually, no, I think it's seared into my heart. Because what I thought he needed as an atheist came back and echoed in the void in my own soul. The loneliness and confusion and fear caused by the abuse I was experiencing at the time forced me to pine for belonging via performance and legalism. I was so good. So absurdly good. In order to compensate for the bad I thought I was causing. I know that I didn't comprehend this at the time. But the way that those words seemed to offer a soothing whisper to my soul that then reverberated into an intolerable pitch of longing is something I can't really explain. But I think it illustrates the opposite of something that is summed up nicely in a prayer attributed to Saint Teresa of Avila. It goes like this: Christ has no body now but yours. No hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes through which he looks compassion on this world. Yours are the feet with which he walks to do good. Yours are the hands with which he blesses the whole world. Back in 1996, when I was 11 years old, I actually helped put the steeple on the church building. I was standing with a couple other kids watching the crane operators do their thing, and Weaver pointed at me and he barked, "You, get in there and grab that." And I had to climb inside the tiny part of the steeple that was lying on the ground to pull a strap through so that it could be hoisted up onto the roof. In 2023, I thought often about the poetic justice of being the person to remove the steeple from a place committed to wickedness that didn't deserve to bear such a symbol. And that might sound shocking and irreverent, but Hyde Park Baptist Church needs to take its nose out of the air and start looking down if they ever want to encounter God. Matthew 25:40 says, "Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." And 1 John 4:20 says, "Whoever does not love their brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God, whom they have not seen." We don't experience for ourselves or demonstrate to others the full measure of God's love through cold theological debate or calloused delivery of just consequence. Although there is a time and place for both of those very important things. To look down is not about condescension, but humility. The act of bowing low to serve is itself the way we look up to God. And a steeple is supposed to be a symbol pointing us to God, a reminder to look beyond ourselves and our own interests. But instead it has come to look more like a middle finger to the least of these. And I thought it only appropriate that it come down until such time that whatever was housed beneath it lived up to such a bold declaration. Anyway, once trial looked like more of a risk than a benefit to the attorneys, I was given the option to choose to go to trial if I agreed to cover all expenses moving forward, which I did. My attorney told me that he has never seen a client refuse the full limits of the insurance policy, and I was growing weary of being compared to his other clients. So around February of 2023, two things happened. First, our exterior cleaning company was sued by an employee who was hurt on the job, and I suddenly found myself in a similar position to the church, which was enlightening. I was connected with an attorney hired by the workers' compensation insurance company and had several conversations with that attorney, which helped me to understand the underbelly of litigation with insurance process. I learned that I was absolutely at any time free to hire secondary counsel to work alongside the insurance attorney to ensure my interests and theirs were aligned. Second, I found and fell down a philosophical rabbit hole called the epistemic condition for moral responsibility, which deals with how knowledge about the risks associated with actions affects responsibility for outcomes. This led me to Thomas Aquinas' work on the ignorance scale and how Christian ethics deals with guilt or culpability. I'd never heard of the difference between vincible and invincible ignorance, only that ignorance is no excuse and sin is sin regardless. The filing of the Adult Survivors Act lawsuit brought up a lot of things for me to wrestle with because I was essentially arguing that adult Shielagh was not to blame, but adult leadership was to blame, and I needed a framework for understanding how this legal idea of foreseeability and reasonableness aligned with Christian ethics. Turns out they're very compatible concepts, and it left me wondering how many adults in leadership and church even truly understand this, and realizing that if they do understand it, it only makes their excuses more absurd. So in legal terms, you'll see in both complaints that we argue that the church knew or should have known about my abuse, and that the benchmark for should have known is simply proving that they would have known had they done the appropriate investigative work needed. In addition to being in a role that carries a duty to protect, Pete Nargi was shown to have repeatedly been offered information sufficient to have necessitated investigation in the form of both his own observation and reports from at least one other person. Pete attempts to absolve himself by claiming he had no real knowledge or suspicion to warrant investigation, which is contradicted by deposition testimony, which I'll share next season. Dale Blue said at our picnic table chat that the board didn't fail in the handling of my abuse because they weren't professionals, meaning they cannot be expected to perform according to the knowledge or skills that they didn't possess. The problem with that line of thinking is twofold. First, Dale and the rest of the board could have known how to handle the situation by simply calling in a professional. Not doing so is a failure. And second, contrary to his claims, the church's own constitution states that the church possesses all resources necessary for resolving disputes between members. Dale admitting to not meeting the requirements necessary to fill the duties of the position that he willingly took is a failure. Taking a position you're not qualified for is a failure in its own right. According to the law, their positions carried a duty to know, and the harm associated with their failure to do so was absolutely foreseeable. In Christian ethics, ignorance is considered part of the fallen condition as a result of sin and separation from God, And therefore, there is a very narrow window where there is no guilt associated with ignorance. This window is called invincible ignorance, meaning it was not resolvable, and it's usually coupled with a form of reduced or absent control, like being a child, or in cases of severe manipulation that impedes a clear view or ability to understand. The ignorance of church leadership was a mix of willful and vincible ignorance, and they had the freedom and maturity to choose, meaning that even within the context of their own ethical framework, they were responsible for failing to protect. Weaver was fully responsible for willful and intentional sin, and I was not responsible and should have been protected. I'm making a big deal out of this because I need you to feel the full weight of what I'm about to read to you from the board meeting minutes, from April 24, 2005, the very same day the board learned of Weaver's abuse. Items 3 and 4 on the list in the minutes. Item 3, discussion of Pastor Weaver's severance pay. He is owed $1,000 in back retirement funds. He has taken 2 of his 5 weeks of vacation for this year. Mind you, it's April. A motion was made and carried to allow him to stay in the house for up to 3 weeks, to give him the $1,000 retirement money, and pay him his remaining 3 weeks of vacation pay. Motion to be presented to the congregation. Item 4. The situation with Shielagh was discussed. It was determined that we will have to contact Bob Jones to advise them, and that it will result in her being expelled from school. End quote. Let me translate for you. How can we soften the blow for Pastor Weaver while we ratchet up the consequences for Shielagh? And this may very well have been subconscious for them. But like we talked about in a prior episode, this is the byproduct of bad theology. These people had such intense moral clarity that the same day that they learned I was abused, and without ever even considering speaking with me directly, they determined that they absolutely must ensure that I was punished immediately and severely. And that same moral clarity informed their decision to negotiate severance pay for a sexual abuser. And you might be tempted to lessen this by saying they were concerned for Weaver's family or they didn't have all the information yet, but that only highlights yet another failure of the board to operate in a biblical manner by collecting all information and making a wise and informed decision. Nothing about the decisions made in the aftermath of my abuse disclosure demonstrate wisdom, godliness, or even a basic understanding of Christian ethics. They are based solely on the whims and feelings of the board. The only order they cared about was Robert's Rule of Order. And then in 2020, some of these same men have the audacity to call me wicked for suing the church. So I want to pause here to remind you of a statement from Alex in that picnic table meeting. We want to give you what we can. From the first meeting with the attorney, we said that. This happened. And I told you earlier that the church attorney offered the full limit on the policy right from the beginning. So on the first pass, that sounds good, doesn't it? They admitted this happened and they wanted to make it right. Wrong. Do not misunderstand this. In 2005, a room full of men with fully developed brains in positions of church leadership argued that I was fully responsible for my abuse and determined in all of their moral superiority that I needed to bear the full brunt of any and all consequences for being abused by the man they were supposed to be keeping in check. Now many of those same grown men, some 40 years my senior, are claiming that they didn't know how to handle sexual abuse reports as some mitigating factor which should absolve them of consequences completely. They walked me right into a trap by failing to exercise a reasonable standard of care and then blamed me, the youngest person in the equation, for not knowing better, and then levied the full weight of consequence against me. But they apply a completely different standard to themselves. The Hyde Park Baptist Church did not and still does not believe that they had anything to make right, much less learn from this situation. They wanted the insurance policy from the Weaver era to throw me a bone for his behavior as long as it meant they stayed out of it. So in Alex's statement, we want to give you what we can, is defined as whatever costs us nothing and keeps you looking evil, greedy, damaged, and divisive.
If your community is dedicated to fostering a safe and supportive environment, connect with Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment, at netgrace.org. Grace's mission is to empower Christian communities to recognize, prevent, and respond to abuse effectively. They provide vital resources and training to help churches understand the complexities of abuse and adopt effective prevention policy and trauma-informed responses.